Chapter 7. I'm going to get a Bible. Elliot did not hurry. He took time to visit his sister Helen, whom he had not seen for 16 years, and spent some time with her family. Letters came back telling how Elliot had talked with Helen and her husband night after night, telling them of the rich possibilities of the Gallatin Valley. In the end, Maynard Randall, Helen's husband, decided to take his wife and 5 children west. He would come back to Bozeman with Elliot. They would travel by train to Corinth, Utah, the nearest railway approach to the Gallatin Valley. Lisha met the travelers at the rail stop with a covered wagon, which would be the most comfortable way to transport them to Montana. He rejoiced to see his older sister again, and he welcomed the children with delight. Elliot's 2 boys had grown to be fine fellows. Melissa had done an excellent job of training them, and Lisha could see how proud Elliot was of his sons. The children swarmed over the covered wagon, shouting with excitement over the prospects of adventurous days on the trail to the Gallatin. Lisha and the other 3 adults did not share their enthusiasm. October had come already, and the days grew chilly. Nights could be uncomfortably cold. Although Susan had sent along every comfort she could think of, the long journey was bound to be difficult. Early on their homeward trip, they stopped at the cabin of a squaw man, white man married to an Indian woman. They asked if they might warm themselves and make a pot of tea. Although they furnished the tea, he charged them $5 for the use of his hot water. The new arrivals from the east made a few remarks about the hospitality of the West, which Lisha thought appropriate. But just wait till you get to Bozeman, he said. The glamour of the wagon trip faded as the days went by, and all the travelers wished for better roads and better weather. Then an early winter storm blanketed the land with snow. They overtook a flock of sheep, and Lisha drove close behind them. The sheep packed down the snow and made traveling easier. They reached Bozeman in November of 1871, found such a welcome as would have warmed the heart of anyone. Lisha blessed Susan in his heart 100 times for all the kindness she heaped on the weary family of his sister Helen and on Elliot's 2 boys. In 1872, the Northern Pacific Railroad sent surveying parties across Bozeman Pass and down the Yellowstone. Hope sprang up in Bozeman, only to be struck down when the people learned that the Indians had successfully frightened the surveyors away. During these troubled years after Lisha lost his land, he often made freighting trips to Salt Lake City. He had made several journeys north to Fort Benton, hauling supplies and other freight. He spent long, lonely hours on the trail, driving his plodding oxen over the wearying miles. During these trips, he had plenty of time to think, to review his experiences in the West. He remembered Joseph Slade, who had first hired him as a helper on his stage line. He had been a good man then, but now Alicia heard the story of Slade's final years. Like many other young men in the West, Slade took to drink. Though he was a good man when sober, liquor turned him into a devil. Finally, one day, crazed with drink, he defied arrest and threw a whole town into an uproar. He was holding up a store with a derringer in each hand when the vigilantes apprehended him and gave him 1 hour to live. When that hour expired, Joseph Slade expired with it. Strange, mused Lisha, that nearly all the bad men hunted by the vigilantes had come from good homes. But in the West, they had yielded to the evil influences and become as wild and reckless as savages. He thought how his brother Elliot had drifted from his home training and become anti-religious. He hoped that now with Susan, Elliot could have a better life. The citizens of Bozeman had built a church, but few people attended it except for funerals or weddings. Lisha felt no inclination to interest himself in any church. Thinking these thoughts, he saw that he was approaching the station at Birdtail. He noticed a fresh mound of earth beside the trail and turned into the station to ask who had been buried in the fresh grave. A girl who lived here at Birdtail, the man in charge told him. She caught smallpox from passengers going through on the stage. Although she got well, the smallpox disfigured her face terribly. So that's why, well, indirectly. She looked so hideous that her people hid all mirrors and never allowed her to see herself. She had become engaged to a fine young man. He planned to come in on the stage last week. Just before the time for him to arrive, the girl came out to meet him. Someone told her to go back in, that she would frighten the passengers. So she did go back, insisted on seeing a mirror, and looked at her horribly altered features, took a gun, and shot herself. Lisha climbed back into the wagon and drove on, pondering this tragedy. Just a young girl, barely 18, and she had taken her own life. Because she had yielded to a moment of despondency, God would burn her in hell for all eternity. She must suffer the torments of the damned forever. The more Lisha thought about it, the more angry he became. He began to talk in a fierce, loud voice, using powerful words. His oxen began to hurry at a faster and faster pace. But Lisha did not bring the bullwhip down on their backs. He just talked on. He had once heard a preacher say that the punishment of the wicked was for the benefit of the saints. He couldn't imagine what kind of saints would be benefited by hearing the shrieks of the damned throughout unending millenniums. I'm going to get a Bible, he shouted at the oxen and the empty trail. There must be an answer to this question, and I intend to find it. On a beautiful June day in 1873, Lisha rode past the cemetery where he could see the splendid monument erected to the memory of John Bozeman. How he wished that Bozeman could have lived to see the town now. He turned his eyes north and east, where granite peaks marked the course of the creek in Bridger Canyon. He liked to think of Bridger and Bozeman, courageous men, both of them. They had lived tough, fearless lives. Somehow he felt kin to them. He reined in his horse and headed for the fort, where he intended to join Kelly, an Army scout. They had been ordered to carry a dispatch from Colonel Gibbon to Major Freeman, who was on maneuvers east of Bozeman Pass. The Indians had grown more and more defiant. Any white men who ventured into Yellowstone Valley east of Bozeman Pass ran the risk of being scalped. Lisha ran his hands through his thick, dark hair. I'd sure hate to lose it that way, he said aloud. At the fort, he found Kelly, and together they went to Colonel Gibbon's office. The colonel handed them the papers in a sealed envelope and showed them on a map the location of Major Freeman's camp. They mounted their horses and rode east towards Kelly's Canyon. 2 miles north of the fort, they entered the foothills and followed an old wagon road used by immigrants until the government closed Bozeman Pass. This road had been the ancient buffalo trail of the Nez Perce and the Flatheads, Columbia River Indians. The Blackfeet also claimed it. Those Ishmaelites of the plains whose hand was against all other men, red or white. Lisha knew that he and Kelly would need to use all their alert precaution in traveling over this disputed territory. The Indians exerted their utmost cunning to prevent wolvers, men who trapped wolves for their pelts, and any other white men from crossing it. The two scouts rode across the path without indecent or descended and descended to the big bend of the Yellowstone River. After reaching the river, they chose to travel by the back hill country, which they reasoned would give them better cover. The Indian scouts who watched the regularly traveled road would be less likely to spot them. A little beyond the mouth of the Shields River, they camped for the night. They picketed their horses, built no fire, but ate a cold supper. Lisha would stand guard the first half of the night and Kelly the last half. Lisha walked to a little knoll just above the spot where the horses were picketed. He listened to the night sounds. A coyote howled in the distance. Others joined him until the eerie chorus of the western plains pierced the night. Lisha felt sleepy. He looked down and tried to see the horses and could just make out their shadowy forms against the plain. Suddenly, one of the horses lifted his head and whinnied. Lisha listened, wide awake now. Would some other horse answer? He heard nothing. Then the horse neighed again. Lisha hurried down to waken Kelly, but Kelly had already heard. Sounds like we may be expecting visitors, he whispered. I'll get the horses in, Lisha volunteered. While Lisha brought the horses, Kelly found his saddle, and as soon as Lisha came up with the horses, Kelly dropped his saddle on the mount and drew up the cinch. Lisha stooped to pick up his saddle when about a dozen Indians seemed to rise up out of the prairie. Lisha turned to leap on his horse, but Kelly's mount, in wild rush to get away, knocked him down. Before Lisha could get to his feet, his own horse bolted. A gun spoke, and then another. Lisha heard Kelly's colt respond and felt a bullet tear through his shoulder. An Indian flashed in for Lisha's scalp. Though wounded, he fought like a tiger, but the Indians outnumbered and overwhelmed him. He did not lose his scalp, but he lost consciousness. When he came to himself, daylight flooded the valley. His Indian captors had bound his hands. He knew himself to be a prisoner of the terrible Sioux. His left arm and shoulder throbbed with pain, and he felt dizzy. When the Indians saw that he had wakened, they gave him a drink of water and told him to get on his horse. Someone had caught and saddled it. Every muscle in his body ached. The Indians must have beat him until he lapsed into unconsciousness. Riding hurt his arm Riding hurt his arm and shoulder, but as time passed, he seemed to get used to the misery and felt able to bear it. He thought of Kelly and hoped that he had escaped and would tell the army about the encounter. All that day, the Indians and their captive rode, and then they camped for the night. The following day, they reached the Indian camp. Lisha estimated the number of lodges at about 30. Word quickly spread that a white prisoner had been brought into the village. Black eyes peered out from the teepees. The dark faces stared at him. His captors led him at once to the chief's lodge. Here they told him to dismount and enter. Already a large crowd of curious Indians had gathered. Lisha looked from one face to another, and he saw that none looked friendly. Even the little children showed plainly their hatred for the white man. Inside the council lodge, the leading men of the village formed a circle. The Indians pushed Lisha into the center of the circle. He longed for someone to dress his wounded shoulder. The pain seemed to grow worse and worse, but he said nothing. He could expect no pity from these savages. The Indians taught for a long time, but Lisha understood little Sioux. At last, a tall Indian, evidently a petty chief, addressed him. "Where you go?" "To the army camp," Lisha explained. "White man paper say this Indian land. You stay out." He looked angry and spoke in a stern voice. "The territory," Lisha said, "is forbidden to white settlers, to mining expeditions, and to wolvers. But I am none of these. I'm on official business for the United States Army. I carry papers to Major Freeman." "You lie," the Indian said. "You no soldier." Lisha understood that because he did not wear a uniform, the Indians thought he could not be a soldier. He also felt that they knew about the Army Scouts and might even be acquainted with his fellow scout Kelly. He also understood from the Indians' talk that the Indians had spotted him and Kelly at the big bend of the Yellowstone and had followed them past the mouth of the Shields River. Lisha answered his accuser. "No, I'm not a soldier. I'm an Army Scout. Army Chief says words on paper I carry to other Army Chief." The chief's face darkened. "White man's words on paper no good. Army chiefs no good. Indian here long time. White man army tell where Indian no can go. Kill all Indians same. Indian starve. He no care." Lisha knew that the chief spoke the truth. He stood before the Indians, his head bowed in shame. For years the white men had disregarded the rights of the red men. They had broken their treaties. They had thought of the Indians as savages, little better than animals, and now Lisha felt that he must pay part of the price for their folly. Other men had suffered for the wrongs of the whites against the Indians, but that didn't make his situation right now any easier to bear. They led him from the council lodge and out of the village. A stout Indian with rope and stakes followed. He began to understand the fate they had prepared for him. He saw a large anthill just ahead. Stories flashed into his mind, stories of Indian torture that he had heard again and again on the western plains. Would they strip him naked? Would they stake him out here exposed to the blistering sun by day and the chill prairie wind by night, while the ants drove him insane or he died of exposure? He heard that they had done such things. The Sioux, the terrible Sioux. He looked at the circle of dark faces and saw not one flicker of pity on any of them.